purpose of this video is going to be to discuss the role of ethics in our professional lives. Now, given the amount of time that many people spend in a profession, which is really a significant chunk of their life, this of course is a rather important discussion. Right? I mean, we can discuss ethics in the context of our personal lives, of our day-to-day lives, at the level of public policy, within our family, and those are all important discussions. But the fact is that much of our lives for many people will be spent in an occupation or a profession, and of course we don't just want to think that ethics get left at the door when you walk into your office building or place of employment. So in this video we're going to look at the role of ethics in our professional life, and we're going to do so primarily by focusing on two different questions. So here are the questions I want to focus on in this video. The first question I want to think about is, what is a profession? Right, we're using the term profession in a somewhat technical sense. Right, you might just think the word profession just means occupation or job or something you do to make money. And it is true that professions are endeavors and activities which we engage in to make money. But in fact, as we're going to see, they're also more than that. Some common examples of employment or occupation that are also considered professions are doctors, nurses, lawyers, psychologists, professors, engineers. And so one thing we're going to be concerned with is, what is it that unites all these sorts of endeavors or occupations? What makes them similar? What is it about them that warrants the title of a professional? The second question is going to touch more directly on ethics. Right, once we have a sense of what a profession is, then we can start to ask ourselves, well, from a practical point of view, if I am a professional, if I'm a member of some profession, what effect does that have on how I should act and on how I should live? And so the way I explain the second question that I want to look at in this video is, what moral obligations are placed upon professionals in virtue of the professional role? Right, so one way to think about this is the following, right? Just in virtue of being a human being, we all have certain moral obligations. You might say that all human beings should not lie, they should not deceive. You might say that all human beings shouldn't kill other human beings. You might say we shouldn't steal, or we should give to charity sometimes, right? You might just say, in virtue of being a human being, regardless of what your profession is, what your hobbies are, where you live, and who your family is, right? Regardless of anything particular about you, you might say that there are certain moral obligations all humans have. But then we might say, well, as you go through life, you do develop certain specific roles. You're a parent, you're an engineer, you're a doctor, right? You're a politician, right? You gain all these sorts of roles, and many of those roles may be professional roles. And so just like we can ask the question, okay, all human beings have X, Y, and Z obligations, and then you might say, well, on top of that, if you're a parent, you also have certain special obligations. Obligations to care for your children, to look out for their well-being. And so we can ask the same question about a professional. If you're a human being, and you're a parent, and you're also a doctor, do you have any special obligations in virtue of being a doctor? Does your status as a medical professional give you certain moral obligations that non-medical professionals don't have? Just like your status as a parent, if you have children, gives you certain obligations that other people don't have, that non-parents don't have. So that's our second question. Given that there's a certain special status given to professions within society, does that special status also come along with certain responsibilities? Does that special status also come along with certain important moral obligations? In order to better discuss the dilemmas, quandaries, and ethical conflicts that can happen in professional contexts, I want to focus on one very famous case study. And this is the case of the Space Shuttle Challenger disaster, which happened in 1986. So in 1986, the Space Shuttle Challenger launched and very tragically exploded 73 seconds after launching. And of course, as you might expect, the entire crew aboard the Space Shuttle Challenger very unfortunately and very tragically lost their lives. Now this event is just considered in itself, just based on the events that I've told you, itself is a horrible disaster, a real unfortunate tragedy that occurred. But what makes this event even more tragic are the events leading up to it. And specifically, the events leading up to it suggest that this was a disaster that could have been prevented. And in fact, that is why we are talking about this case. For us, the real story of the Space Shuttle Challenger disaster is the engineer Roger Boisjoly, who worked at the engineering firm Morton Thiokol, that was responsible for, in part, for the construction of the rocket boosters on the Space Shuttle Challenger. So I'm going to read through some accounts of what Boisjoly did prior to the launch to give you a sense of what I mean here. So 6 months before the Space Shuttle Challenger exploded over Florida on January 28, 1986, Roger Boisjoly wrote a portentous memo. He warned that if the weather was too cold, seals connecting sections of the shuttle's huge rocket boosters could fail. And he said, in fact, that, quote, the result could be a catastrophe of the highest order. Loss of human life, he wrote. And later on, he recounted that he, ultimately, of course, the launch went through, and he and his other engineers watched as this launch occurred. And at first, they were optimistic. They said, okay, maybe we made it through. Maybe it's going to be okay. And of course, 73 seconds later, they saw that their worst predictions and their worst fears had actually come true. Now, of course, he didn't just have these concerns to himself. He brought these concerns to his employer, Morton Thiokol. So he wrote this memo, and the memo was meant to jolt Morton Thiokol, the company that made the boosters and employed Mr. Boisjoly. In July 1985, a task force had been formed, partly on Mr. Boisjoly's recommendation, to examine the effect of cold on the boosters. The effort, however, had become mired in paperwork, procurement delays, and a rush to launch the shuttle, according to later investigations. Meanwhile, his apprehensions only grew. The night before the Challenger's liftoff, the temperature dipped below freezing, unusual for Florida. The cold was unprecedented for a shuttle launching, and it prompted Mr. Boisjoly and the other engineers to plead that the flight be postponed. Their bosses, under pressure from NASA, rejected the advice. So Mr. Boisjoly and the other engineers who were concerned about this, they brought their concerns to their employer, and they brought them, of course, to NASA, but their employer, under pressure from NASA, who wanted to make sure the launch got through, who didn't want to delay it any further, pushed those concerns aside. Now, in the aftermath, upper managers at NASA subsequently denied that they had known about the Thiokol protest, and said that had they known about it, they would have halted the launch. 3 weeks later, in an interview with NPR's Daniel Swerdling, which was unrecorded and confidential, Boisjoly said the following: I fought like hell to stop that launch. I'm so torn up inside, I can hardly talk about it even now. And of course, you can imagine the emotional turmoil that Boisjoly would have had to go through given what happened. He knew this was a problem. He suspected it was a problem. He brought it to the proper authorities. He did everything he possibly could to warn them about this disaster, and was constantly brushed aside and ignored. Ultimately, NASA wanted to push the launch through, and it ended up being just exactly the disaster that Boisjoly had feared. In the aftermath of the Space Shuttle Challenger disaster, there was a commission established by President Reagan to investigate the incident. It was called the Rogers Commission. And not only did Boisjoly bring his concerns to his employer prior to the disaster, but in the aftermath at this commission, he also testified about what had happened. And his willingness to testify at the Rogers Commission cemented Boisjoly's status as a famous whistleblower. Okay, so what is this term whistleblower? Well, one philosopher, Cecil Bach, defines it as the following: whistleblowers sound an alarm from within the very organization in which they work, aiming to spotlight neglect or abuses that threaten the public interest. So if you are at your place of employment, if you're at your job, and you see some wrongdoing that's occurring that isn't just sort of a personal wrong, maybe against you, but something that would affect the wider public, some serious moral wrong, and you blow the whistle on your employer, you say something is wrong is going on here, you alert the public about that, then you're a whistleblower. And this is, of course, exactly what Boisjoly did at the Rogers Commission. He testified, here's one quote from his testimony. He said that there was unethical decision-making resulting from intense customer intimidation. What is he talking about? He said that there was absolutely unethical decision-making on the part of his employer. They never should have gone through with the launch, and they never should have okayed those rocket boosters in that temperature. And of course, the intense customer intimidation. Who's the customer? The customer was NASA, who also wanted to push the launch through, putting the lives of the astronauts in danger. Now, I want to think about this concept of a whistleblower for a second, and we should think about where the term comes from. So, when you think about a whistleblower, the image that comes to your mind is probably a referee in a sporting event. And think about what a referee is supposed to do. A referee calls balls and strikes. They say when a foul has occurred. They say when someone has broken the rules. And of course, the way they do this is as a neutral party, right? If you watch a football game, a basketball game, right, you'll see each team has its own uniforms and colors. But the referees are always in a neutral outfit, right? They're always usually wearing black and white stripes. And this is, of course, for a practical, but also has a sort of symbolic element. The referee is not supposed to be beholden to any side. They're just completely neutral party. And we think that's in part what gives them the authority or the standing to say when a foul has been called. Right? If you knew a referee had been paid by, for instance, one of the teams in the game, then you would start to question the calls that he or she was making. You would start to question his or her objectivity. Now, the reason I bring this up is because, of course, let's compare that to this case. Boisjoly is calling a foul here. He's saying someone broke the rules, and specifically the moral rules against putting one's clients or putting other people in the way of serious harm. But also notice that Boisjoly is not a neutral party here. Boisjoly is actually part of one team, you might say. He is employed by Morton Thiokol, who actually pays him. And so because Boisjoly is not a neutral party, one thing we might wonder is, where does he get the standing? Where does he get the authority to call balls and strikes? Where does he get the authority to say that his own employer has committed a moral wrong? Some people have sometimes been uncomfortable with the idea of whistleblowing based on a sort of idea of employee loyalty. The idea that when you join a workplace, when you join some company, when you work for a firm, right, you have some obligations, maybe not absolute, but some obligations of loyalty to them, given that you're part of the organization, given that they're paying you, etc., etc. And so the first thing to think about here is, we might wonder, well, what is the important moral value at stake that would allow Boisjoly to blow the whistle and have that be acceptable, even though he is not a neutral party? And ultimately, I think this is going to come down to the fact that, as we're going to discuss, there may just be certain moral obligations that come from being part of a profession, not just having a job, not just being an employee, but being a part of a profession. Now, another important thing to note about the whistleblowing that Boisjoly engaged in is it really had serious ramifications for his personal and professional life. And, maybe Boisjoly is an extreme case to some extent, but these sort of personal ramifications, these consequences that he experienced are not rare. This is often what happens to whistleblowers. So I'm going to read you through a few accounts of this. So Boisjoly testified before the Presidential Commission that investigated the tragedy. Later, he said his whistleblower status profoundly affected his personal and professional life, with both neighbors and workmates giving him the cold shoulder. He said, when I realized what was happening, it absolutely destroyed me. It destroyed my career, my life, everything else. I'm just now getting back to the point where I think I'll be able to work as an engineer again. Again, he paid the very stiff price often exacted by whistleblowers. Thiokol cut him off from space work, he was shunned by colleagues and managers, and a former friend warned him, and I think the phrase former friend, that tells something in itself, but a former friend warned him, if you wreck this company, I'm going to put my kids on your doorstep. Which I must admit, I'm not exactly sure what that statement means, but it does sound at least more than mildly threatening. He had headaches, double vision, and depression. He yelled at his dog and his neighbors and skipped church to avoid people, despite the fact that he was a very devout and religious Mormon. And colleagues and neighbors even shunned Boisjoly. right? NASA tried to blackball him from the industry. Managers isolated him in his position and made life a living hell on a day-to-day basis. And ultimately, he was diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder from this whole ordeal and would never again return to work for Thiokol. Now, the reason I think bringing these facts to light is important is because many people believe that not only was it okay that Boisjoly blew the whistle, but that he had an obligation to do so, that given his status and position, he had a moral obligation to blow the whistle. And this is important because notice what they're saying is he had a moral obligation to incur a serious personal and professional cost to himself. He had a moral obligation to do an action, namely testify at the Rogers Commission, that he knew would cause him great personal and professional harm. And so again, this should make us wonder, where could such an obligation come from? Where could an obligation come from that would actually require us to do ourselves harm in service of the public good? And as I said before, I think it really does come down to thinking carefully about what does it mean to be a professional and what moral obligations come from our professional roles. We can gain further insight into the nature of professional ethics by looking at another step in the process that led to this launch happening. And so I'm going to read through an account here given by Michael Davis. So on the night of the 27th of January 1986, Robert Lund was worried. And of course, the 27th was the day before the launch. The Space Center was counting down for a shuttle launch the next morning. Lund, Vice President for Engineering at Morton Thiokol, had earlier presided over a meeting of engineers that unanimously recommended against the launch, and we would presume that this meeting did include Boisjoly. He had concurred and informed his boss, Gerald Mason. Mason informed the Space Center. Lund had expected the flight to be postponed. The center's safety record was good. It was good because the center would not allow a launch unless the technical people approved, and Lund, being one of those technical people, had not approved. So the first thing to know is that Lund, as Vice President for Engineering, his approval was needed for the launch to go through. But the Space Center pushed back. They wanted to launch, and this meant that Lund was the only person standing in the way of launching. Now, his first response was to repeat all his objections, but then his boss, Mason, said something that made him think again. Mason asked him to think like a manager rather than an engineer. The exact words seemed to have been, take off your engineering hat and put on your management hat. Ultimately, Lund did and changed his mind. The next morning, the shuttle exploded during liftoff, killing all aboard. An O-ring had failed, just as Boisjoly and the other engineers had suspected. Now, why is this important? Well, let's think about Lund's career arc for a second, right? He was originally an engineer. He has his engineering background. And now he's in a sort of management position as vice president for engineering at Morton Thiokol. And one way to think about this is this seems to bring forth a certain sort of conflict. On the one hand, of course, this is why the quote, take off your engineering hat and put on your management hat, is so crucial here. On the one hand, he is part of the profession of engineering. He is an engineer that is committed to certain sorts of ethical values and ideals, one of them namely being the safety of the products they have and the safety and security of the public. On the other hand, he's also now a manager, and managers are responsible for being organized and efficiently running the organizations they head in order to churn out a profit. And it seems that these two things can come into conflict and did exactly that in this case. And so we should think a little bit more about this contrast between thinking like a manager and thinking like an engineer. What does it mean to think like a manager? What would it mean to take off one's engineering hat in order to do that? And in our textbook, Lisa Newton poses this as an ethical question in the following way. Should engineers leave the status of employee by joining management? By doing that, do they not abandon the engineer's commitment to a quality product in favor of the management goal of cost cutting? And it's also important to see that to say that I'm going to think like a manager now, to say that I'm going to leave behind my professional commitments of engineering, is just to leave sort of my status as a professional. And you might say, well, wait a minute, why can't we just say a manager is a professional? Why aren't you also thinking like a professional when you're thinking like a manager? Can't a professional just be someone who runs an organization in an organized and efficient manner with the goal in mind of making money or profit for the firm? Well, it's interesting that actually the idea of having management as a profession has been floated before and is not necessarily new. As the following account explains, around the turn of the century, the leaders of the business school movement proposed to ensure that the large corporation would be run in the interests of society by turning the occupation of management into a bona fide profession. So there used to be a push to see managers in firms and businesses as professionals with not only commitments to the firm itself, but also commitments to the wider public and a commitment to ethical values. But as these commentators explain, that ambition has so far gone unrealized. The claim that managers are professionals does not withstand scrutiny. Unlike doctors and lawyers, managers don't need a formal education, let alone a license to practice, and this may be the most important thing, nor do they adhere to a universal and enforceable code of conduct. Right, as we're going to see, one central trait of being a professional is not just that you're there to make money, but that you're committing yourself to certain values, certain ethical and moral values, and certain meaningful pursuits that are beyond just your ability to make money. And that were you to sort of just leave behind might be a real strike against your integrity. And this is why the question comes up. If you are an engineer, if you have that status, is it acceptable from you from a moral point of view to put aside your commitments as an engineer and simply think like a manager, simply think in a sort of profit-based way? Now, in order to better understand this claim, we need a little better sense of exactly what is a profession. We've sort of hinted at it, but what does it mean to think like an engineer? More broadly, what does it mean to think like a professional? And in our textbook, Lisa Newton identifies the following central characteristics of what it means to be a profession. So first, if you're part of a profession or you're a professional, then you are privy to a certain set of knowledge, right? There's a certain base of knowledge that you have that the average person doesn't, right? So she explains the possession of knowledge of an art or esoteric body of knowledge, scientific or otherwise, that's not easily acquired. So if you're part of a profession, you've spent years studying to learn and possess this body of knowledge, and it takes a lot of effort and diligence and study, which the average person is simply not going to have. We can see how this is true in the case of doctors and psychologists and professors who are all supposed to be experts in their field. And this comes along with the corresponding duty to actually advance that knowledge through your own research, right? You're grateful for the opportunity that you have had to learn this body of knowledge, and now you want to further it forward for the next generation. And of course, this alone shows you how different a profession is from just a mere job or occupation where you're just there to earn a living or to make money. And there's not a sort of commitment to the fundamental underlying goal or the fundamental underlying aim of the endeavor itself. Some other criteria of a profession she puts forward: service to clients and service to the public. As a professional, you have a certain special relationship with your client, and you're supposed to serve their best interest, even if that means a loss at profit to yourself, right? So even if there's a way that you could deceive or lie to your client, or maybe not tell the whole truth, right? Think of the sort of stereotypical used car salesman. You go there, and maybe they sort of are working within the law, but they're not going to be overly forthcoming with the problems in the car. And that's because they want to sell as many cars as they can and make as much money as they can. They don't have that dedication to their clients in the same way that we would hope a doctor or a professor or a psychologist or an engineer would have. In addition, there's a certain sort of service to the public. Let's go back to our stereotypical used car salesman. If a used car salesman, again, is working within the law, but maybe knows the cars they're putting out aren't the safest for the public, that's not really their concern. So professionals are dedicated to their clients and they're dedicated to the public. And of course, this is all tied up in their having a code of ethics. It's the idea that professionals, in virtue of this, are committed to broader ethical ideals beyond just their own personal gain. And as you can see, of course, monetary gain is also part of it. Professionals are paid for what they do. Otherwise, they're just amateurs or someone exercising a hobby, maybe. So it's not that they don't make money. It's not that they would do it if they weren't making it. But one way to think about it is that for a professional, the endeavor or the activity they're engaging in is something that they think is important and crucial as a human activity, even if they were not getting paid for it. It's something that has real value apart from the fact that they are earning money by doing it as well. And because it has that real value, it's crucial, and because they have a special status, it is absolutely crucial that professionals have a professional creed or code of ethics that goes beyond just the normal sort of code of morality of ethics that we would expect from the average person. And of course, if that's the case, then we can begin to see why we might say that Boisjoly had an obligation to blow the whistle. If as an engineer, he's not just committed to personal gain or the gain of his company, but service to clients and service to the public, and if he has to uphold a code of ethics, then we might say, look, even if it comes at great personal cost to you, this sort of is the obligation you incur by having the status of an expert engineer and professional. This is your duty to society to blow the whistle and point out harms that could hurt the public interest. It might also explain why the actions of Lund, the vice president at Thiokol, who used to be an engineer and now is thinking like a manager, might also explain why, not just from a human point of view is what he did wrong, not just the fact that he put the astronauts in danger, but from a professional point of view. He made a commitment to commit himself to certain ethical values that are part of the engineering profession. And by agreeing to simply think like a manager and put his engineering hat aside, it seems like he put those values aside as well. And that's why that quote in that question is so critical. The idea of when his boss told him, put aside your engineering hat, and instead think like a manager. If you're really committed to the profession of engineering, then it shouldn't just be something that you can so easily put aside. So given that there is this difference between thinking like a manager and thinking like an engineer or a professional, it stands to reason that each would be guided by a different kind of ethics or morality. So we might say that when thinking like a manager, you're probably guided by what we'll call the market ethic. And as Newton explains, the professional ethic really should stand in distinct contradiction from the market ethic. Now, what is the market ethic? It's just the idea that in a free market, if each party looks after their own interests and their interests only, the result would be the advancement of the common good. So the idea is that in a free market economy, if everyone pursues their own interests, then at least theoretically, this would actually create happiness and prosperity for everyone through the dissemination of products and services. And so therefore, when dealing on the market, it's not only the right, but the duty of the merchant and customer alike to seek his own advantage. In a strictly market transaction, the person selling a product or service is attempting to get as much money as they can from it, and the customer is attempting to get as much value as they can from that product or service. Both are pursuing their own self-interest, and within limits, that is perfectly reasonable. But when we think like an engineer, or more broadly, think like a professional, what we should be able to now see is that we should be guided by a very different ethic. The professional needs to be guided by the professional ethic. As Newton explains, the professional ethic is just the opposite. Dealing with the client, the professional's first duty is to find out if the client needs professional services at all, and if not, to bid him farewell without taking a penny. Right, so if you go to a doctor and it turns out that you think something's wrong with you, but nothing is, then that doctor would be extremely negligent if they said, well, maybe we'll just do this operation or procedure, you don't really need it, and maybe it'll even be bad for you, but it would allow me to make more money. right? That would be to very much confuse the market ethic with the professional ethic. The professional is supposed to potentially incur certain costs to themselves for the sake of the advantage of the client, which makes it very different from the market ethic. And of course, this is actually absolutely crucial because professionals are given a certain status in society, they are given a certain amount of trust from the public, and if it turned out that professionals were abusing that trust, it would really undermine the foundations of the profession as a whole. And because this is the case, because there's this difference between the professional ethic and the market ethic, it's important to be very wary of the ways in which the market ethic can creep in to professional spaces. So Newton gives the following example. She says, for example, in the healthcare area, insurance companies that carry health care insurance now own many medical practices. This arrangement turns physicians into employees without protections. If a physician costs the practice too much in a given year, he or she can be separated from it and lose his or her entire practice. So what's the point here? The point is, well, look, if the way healthcare is disseminated is through insurance companies, and insurance companies are ultimately there to make a profit, then insurance companies don't have as great of an incentive to want to cover very expensive procedures. Because if they do, then of course that particular doctor doing those expensive procedures will be costing them a lot of money. And so you can imagine how there would be pressure upon physicians to maybe shy away from those procedures, even if they are needed, even if they're in the best interest of the client. And so this is why this is a very important point, that when we think about professional ethics, we also have to think about the way society is organized. We have to think about how can we carve out a space for professions where they are relatively secure from the market ethic and are ultimately able to serve the public and serve their clients in a way that best serves their interests. To conclude this video, I want to return to the theme of self-sacrifice. To this point, we have outlined the idea of a profession as an activity or endeavor which could demand a great deal from those who are in it. If you are a member of a profession, you have an obligation not just to do what you need to do in order to complete your assigned task and make money, but you might actually be called upon to engage in self-sacrificial behavior for the sake of your client or even the public interest. And this is, of course, precisely why we might say, look, yes, Boisjoly had to incur great personal cost and personal harm in virtue of his whistleblowing. But perhaps it was still obligated because of the higher calling of his profession as not just an employee, but as an engineer. But on the other hand, we should push back against this somewhat. Because at the end of the day, although professionals do have a higher calling, they are still also employees. And we also want to be wary of the ways in which we might allow employees to be mistreated and say they need this sort of absolute self-sacrificial commitment to their work. And so to see what I mean here, let's examine the following question that Newton poses in the textbook. Newton asks, should nurses join unions, organizations of employees formed to protect their material interests, wages, benefits, job security, vis-a-vis the employers? How does protection of nurse salaries fit with the protection of the patient's interests? Could it ever be justifiable for nurses to go out on strike, leaving their patients untended? But if not, what power could the union have? So think about an essential worker, like a nurse, for instance, someone who, especially now in this time of the COVID-19 pandemic, somebody who is on the front lines fighting a deadly disease and whose work at this time is especially now more than ever deemed essential. When we have workers who do that sort of very important work, is it ever acceptable for them to go on strike? And if you say it's not acceptable for them to go on strike, then haven't you taken all leverage away from those employees and essentially left them at the mercy of their employer to accept whatever wages or benefits or job situation they grant them? Right now, in order to understand this conflict, we do, of course, need to have a sense of what are the costs of nursing strikes, because nursing strikes have actually happened before. And so one philosopher, Paul Neiman, discusses nursing strikes, and he gives this sort of summary of some of the negative consequences that occur. Neiman tells us the most intuitive argument against the morality of nurses' strikes is that they cause harm to patients. A study of nurses' strikes in New York between 1984 and 2004 shows that hospital mortality rates increased by 19.4%, and 30-day readmission rates increased by 6.5% for patients admitted during the strike. According to this study, mortality and readmission rates increased even though nurses provided the legally required 10-day waiting period prior to striking, which gives hospitals time to delay elective procedures, transfer patients, or hire replacement nurses, often referred to as scabs, to cross the picket line. While these measures may have had some impact on patient care, they were not enough to prevent a decline in the quality of care patients received during the strike. So the evidence we have is pretty clear. During nurses' strikes, patients do suffer. And if that's the case, then we have a real ethical conflict here. He explains this forms the basis of the nurses' dilemma. They feel an obligation for the safety and care of their patients, but also recognize the need to strike to protect their own wages and benefits, or to advocate for changes to working conditions that will improve care for future patients. So this is a real conflict within professional ethics. Professionals are dedicated to a higher calling. Nurses are dedicated to the health and safety of their patients. At the same time, nurses and other professionals are employees. They are subject to certain working conditions, certain wages, who have a right not to be mistreated. And historically, the only way that employees really have been able to gain a foothold and gain rights is through having the threat of the ability to strike. So I'll be interested to hear what you think about this. Is it ever acceptable for nurses or other essential employees who clients are desperately depending on, is it ever acceptable for them to strike? And if it's not, then how do we ensure that nurses and other essential employees are protected as employees? How do we make sure their employee rights are protected? But I will stop there. Thank you as always for listening, and I will see you next time.